Hello and welcome. In this video we are going to be talking about the AND statement and determining when the AND statement is true and when the AND statement is false. So we have an example set up right here. Washington, D.C. is a state and presidential elections are held every 4 years. So we have, let me label some parts here. An AND statement is a conjunction that ties together two simple statements, two simple logical statements. So here's one. Okay, Washington, D.C. is a state. Now we're going to label these as components. So here's component 1, and then over here, this is going to be our second component. Okay, so let me label that as a component. And then again, this right here, the AND, will be our conjunction. So we got two components, and that makes up the AND statement. Now, one of the biggest confusions when dealing with compound statements is the truth values. And there are two things to consider. The truth values of your components, so for example, the truth value of Washington, D.C., and then the truth value of the entire AND statement. So again, there are two things to consider. Okay, truth value of the components, and then the truth value of the AND statement. So for the moment, let's just determine the truth values of the components. So Washington, D.C. is a state. That, as a statement, is false. And then over here, presidential elections are held every 4 years. And this one would be true. Okay. Now, these are going to help determine the truth values of the AND statement. Okay. So when is an AND statement true? An AND statement, or a conjunction, is true when all of its components are true. So even though that you may have components that could be true or false, it's going to help determine the truth value of the AND statement. And the AND statement is true when all the components are true. So this is an example up here. This is an example of a false AND statement because not all of the components are true. Now this means a conjunction is false when at least one of its components is false. So all the components could be false, but the AND statement will be false when at least one of them. And you can see that here's your at least one. Okay, now they both could be false, which still makes the entire AND statement false. But we only need at least one of them to be false to make the AND statement false. So now that we know that we're dealing with a false statement up here, I want to bring out what we call a truth table. Okay, now right before we look at the truth table, up here we have our AND statement. What I'm going to do is I'm going to label this as statement P, and then this one I'll label as statement Q. Okay, so we'll represent statements, simple statements of our AND statement as letters P and Q. So down here I have my truth table. Now what it's going to do is it's basically going to map out the truth values to this AND statement right here. Okay, so with let's do this. True, we can have our first component be true and our second component be true. Now up here what it says is that a conjunction is true when all of its components are true. So we have two true components. What's going to happen is it's going to make our AND statement also true. Now what if the first component's true but the second component's false? That falls into the second category here, where a conjunction is false when at least one of the components is false. So here's that false component, which makes the AND statement false. Now what if the first component is false but the second was true? Well, it's still going to make a false AND statement because, again, one of the components is false. And then finally, when both are false, then hopefully you can understand that the AND statement is also going to be false, because in this case what happens is everything you just said was false, so how can the AND statement be false? Or how can the AND statement be true? You basically lied about everything. So when given an AND statement, the only things you really have to do is determine the truth values of the components, and then once you determine the truth values of the components and you know that it's an AND statement, then just take a look down here, and now this would work with 3 components, 4 components. Point is that the AND statement will be true only when they are all true. Okay, the moment any of these components are false, it makes the entire AND statement false.